Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Dhammaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. Dutiyampi Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Dutiyampi Dhammaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Dutiyampi Sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. Tatiyampi Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi. Tatiyampi Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Dhammaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. So I hope that everybody's keeping well wherever it might be. And I just came back from a little trip to the Kandy area and to another area in Colombo. So it was nice. Had the chance to visit a couple of senior monks that I haven't seen for a long time and pay some respects. And one of the topics that kind of often comes up in a monk's life or a practitioner's life is the balance between internal development and external management. So, unfortunately, we don't live in an entirely internal world. There is an external world that a person has to deal with. And this external world can impact the internal world. So this can happen in any number of ways, but in particular, people who practice meditation, we live amongst other people. Even if you live in solitude, the way that the Buddha has established the Sangha and established the sasana, his religion, is such that there's always a mutual interdependence. What that means practically is that monks can never be entirely pure hermits. And what he recommends strongly for lay people is that they always have an association with monks. So there's always this kind of balance. There's always this kind of, I guess you say balance between these internal factors and external factors. Now, of course, people having a body, if you're a monk or a layperson, whatever it might be, one has a body. That body has material needs. It needs the four basic things: food, clothes, shelter, and medicine. And then, in addition to a body, people have minds. They have perceptions. And so they have perceptions about what it is that a monk should be or a layperson should be, how a practitioner should practice and how they shouldn't practice. And all of these very complicated things factor in. That's to say nothing of the fact that people actually have very, very different personalities, very, very different ways of looking at the world. And these ways of looking at the world are sometimes not always, they're not always compatible. One person can be looking at one thing, another person can be looking at that same thing and have completely different perceptions of it, completely different perceptions of what its meaning is, whether it's wholesome or unwholesome, etc. The interesting thing about this is that in some cases, it's not necessarily just the case that something has a completely wholesome or unwholesome aspect to it in and of itself. The wholesomeness or unwholesomeness of particular things, particular situations that one finds oneself in, their wholesomeness or unwholesomeness is sometimes dependent on the aggregate perceptions of people involved. So, what it means is that as one comes to practice meditation, whether as a layperson or a monk, one always has to have other people's opinions and perceptions in mind to a certain extent. Oftentimes we talk about the importance of basically staying true to one's principles and these kind of things, which is true. Actually, one should never violate the principles of the Dhamma in order to, say, please other people or to manage their perceptions or whatever it might be. The principles have to be there. But there is also this other external element of people's perceptions and the way that they view the world. So, as monks, you hear or see or as practitioners in general, you hear or see or even experience various times where you may be acting very skillfully internally, but externally people don't like what you're doing. This can be for any number of reasons. There's, over the millennia, Buddhism has evolved in so many different ways. And so the perceptions of what a monk should be doing or what a lay person should be doing and how the best way to approach things, there's so many different perceptions. And these perceptions create opinions, and people have to make judgments on the basis of what they perceive. So what it means is that what we see in the canon is that the Buddha taught meditation. He taught the Dhamma, and the way that he interacted with people was on the basis of skillfulness. And the principles of the Dhamma, the Buddha never violated. And it's kind of, of course, the Buddha impeccable in his conduct. But you see that the extent to which he divulged information, the way in which he taught, and the way in which he interacted was something which he would pull back from or teach more or less fully, depending on the person involved and the perceptions that they have. One of the things is that if people are very, very sincere practitioners, then if they're sincere, if they have a very close relationship with a monk, and if they have a lot of faith in that monk, and also if they have similar personalities to that monk, or even to other fellow lay practitioners, this is a situation where it's safe for people to discuss and be completely open to talk about things in a way that one has to be much less careful. But if one is not in a situation like that, if one is speaking to people at general or a crowd at general, then sometimes one has to be careful. One has to give thought to these things. In other words, one has to give thoughts to politics. It's a fact. It's an unfortunate fact of the life of a practitioner, whether it's a lay person or a monastic, is when a person withdraws themselves from the economy of exchange, where one is trading money for things, then one has essentially immersed oneself in an economy where it relies on one's relationships with other people. So, how does one then maintain the principles of the Dhamma without tipping over so that one violates, say, the principles of the Dhamma to please other people, or one holds back too much out of fear? And what this requires is a huge degree of skillfulness. It requires both a very strong knowledge of what the principles of the Dhamma are, which one gains basically through studying and through thinking. One thinks about these things. What's the Vinaya rule in this case? How did the Buddha act in this case? What's the Dhamma principle behind this in this case? One has to know the principles thoroughly. It helps a lot to know them thoroughly on an intellectual level, so that when an external situation, an external, say, political situation, an external situation with other people that one is involved with comes up, one can know intellectually what is the principle that's at stake here. What's the principle that I'm dealing with here? That's one thing. The second aspect of it has to do with trying to learn to read other people's behavior and their motivations. It's actually, one can come to Buddhism with these very, one might say like idealistic ideas. And actually, one has to have that. It's good to have it to a certain extent. If one is coming from a Western country where Buddhism has no cachet, there's no benefit to being a monk almost in terms of your reputation. Actually, your reputation will go down if you give up a good paying job and become a monk. And the only reason you're doing that is for the sake of Nibbana. And this is an extremely wholesome aspiration. What comes along with idealism, though, is the idea that that's the way that everybody else is going to think, and that they're going to have the same ideas about how to achieve that you will, which is just not realistic. It's not the case. I've been in situations as a monk where you have two different monks. You can tell they're both sincere. They're both coming at a particular situation from different angles. And it's not 100% easy to determine who's totally right and who's totally wrong. And they really don't get along. It creates the conditions for very strong politics. And because of these politics, very terrible things can happen to both lay practitioners or monastics. The human element in practice is something that always has to be very carefully considered. So in addition to this idealism, one has to gauge the motivations, intentions, and perceptions of the people that one is dealing with. One has to evaluate, how are they behaving in this situation? How are they behaving in that situation? And what, more importantly, do their actions indicate about their personalities and their behavior through their actions, not through their words. Been listening to a fellow named Joe Navarro recently, who's an ex-FBI agent. And he, of course, would have been involved in trying to catch many different criminals who were always trying to hide their actions. He has really excellent insights into human behavior. This is one of the things he emphasizes, to watch people's behavior. And what does it indicate about their intentions and the way that they'll act in the future? Because on this works on two different levels. One, it tells us how they're probably going to behave towards us in the future, given a similar situation. And number two, more importantly, from a Dhamma perspective, it tells us how we're going to be able to interact with them in a win-win way to grow in the Dhamma. So, in dealing with other people, it requires this kind of keeping two things in mind. What could happen that's going to harm me? And how can I use this situation? How can I interact with them in a way that's beneficial in the Dhamma? I remember there was one time I was living at a monastery with a senior monk who was very, very compassionate, actually. And I would say his compassion is very, very high. And he would have this ability to gauge the intentions of the people around. And he would act in certain ways depending on your intention, but not just depending on your intention, depending on the way that you did it. So in that situation, I was being, I had what you might say like a very strong intentions, noble intentions, you could say. But the way in which I was carrying things out was really unskillful. It was kind of, well, this is the right way to do things. I'm doing, that's that. And he would wait and wait and wait and wait. And he would arrange situations such that you could see this is going to be the consequence if you keep behaving that way. Although you may be right in terms of your principles, the way in which you behave is affecting people and their perceptions in this way. And it's going to come back on you. And indeed it did. That's why it's very good to have a long training period as a young monk where you make all these mistakes, some of these serious mistakes, under the guidance of a teacher who may yell at you, may do harsh things to you, but at least you don't have to learn the hard way. So, in terms of people's behaviors, what do their behaviors indicate about their intentions towards us and the way that they perceive us and our practice? This is something that one has to keep in mind as a meditator. And how is it that I can work with them? How is it that I can practice with them, discuss with them in such a way that it benefits both me and them? Now, what this also requires is that in terms of meditation, coming from a Western culture is very competitive and very oriented towards showing, how good I am. I'm this good, I know this much, I can do this much. And even in interviews, you've got to go and tell people how great you are. In a normal political situation, though, one has to be very careful about telling other people about one's meditation experiences and being completely open about them. Because it can be a threat to other people. It may make them feel like, okay, you feel this way, so do you feel that you're higher than me? and then they may disagree with your interpretation of that experience. And so this is something that one has to be very, very discerning about. This is what the Buddha himself was very, very discerning about this. He called his teachings a handful of leaves. In other words, the amount of things that he knew through direct experience was immense. But what he taught was a handful of leaves. When one comes to meditate as a meditator, one will inevitably experience and encounter things that are outside of the actual handful of leaves that are in the suttas. You can see where they come into the categories that he's taught in the suttas. The teachings in the suttas are often just like categories. And the amount of things that a person can experience underneath those categories is immense. It's huge. And sometimes one has to use or manipulate things that come under the category but that aren't mentioned in specific detail in the suttas. In these cases, whatever knowledge or experience one gains it can be good to be very discerning about who one shares it with and how one shares it. Because this can have very bad political ramifications for a person. And these political ramifications, whether one's a lay person or a monk, affect one's ability to practice. Why is that? It's because we have a body. And whether you're a lay person or a monk, you need food, clothes, shelter, and medicine. And another important element of the situation is that one needs to have good friends to practice with. So Ajahn Chah had this very famous phrase, is true but not right, right but not true. In other words, the principles of the Dhamma need to be kept in mind and protected at all costs, even at the cost of one's life. And one doesn't say want to violate the Vinaya, even at the cost of one's life. But one also wants to make sure that one is watching externally to see what the situation is, to see if a storm cloud is gathering, and if it is, one better get out of the way. To see how people perceive one, what are their desires, what are their intentions, how do they think about themselves, How would they feel? What do they want from you? What do they want to do to you? All these things are things that one has to keep in mind. And that one can navigate the external world skillfully in such a way that one can continue to practice. So the Buddha taught this handful of leaves. And as far as the way that one interacts with people, it can be good to keep this in mind as well. Just because whatever experiences one has had as a meditator, they may be good, they may be excellent, they're good and excellent, and it's enough. Not everybody has to know about them. It's enough for one's own practice. The excellence of the Buddha's teachings is something that doesn't require anybody else to give anything or do anything to add to their excellence necessarily. What one gains internally is one's own treasure. And in the way that one shares that treasure, in the way that one makes it known or makes it available, is something that one wants to consider really, really carefully. Really, really carefully, because it can come back. These political situations can come back. So in all the time, one doesn't just want to be right, but one wants to be true. One doesn't just want to have the principles in mind, but one wants to have in mind the aspects of skillful navigation of external culture, so that one can continue to practice towards the goal. Because actually this is all that matters. All the time what we see externally, what the external world can give us is reputation. It can give us gains, offerings, and fame. We need requisites to a certain extent to survive. But the most dangerous one of these things is reputation among meditators, because both among lay people and monks, this is where daggers can come out. This is where dangers can come out. And this is where obstructions can come into one's own path in trying to strive for the highest goal. So whatever it is that one does, of course, the most important thing is this internal assurance, this internal keeping the principles of the Dhamma in mind. And this can make one happy even if one's external reputation gets completely destroyed and falls away. I could tell you many stories of different monks. So the things that monks have to encounter sometimes is pretty intense. But as well, one has to and wants to learn these external skills so that one can navigate skillfully. Because unfortunately, although we may come to the Dhamma with these very excellent ideals, and these ideals are what sustain us and keep us going on the path, and what can eventually lead us to experience some of the things that the Buddha talked about. These ideals are very important to guard and keep safe. Other people's ideals may be different. Their perceptions may be different. Their ideas of the Dhamma may be different. And this is something that one has to keep in mind, so that one can protect the most noble endeavors that one has in one's life and move towards Nibbana skillfully. Okay, so leave that for reflection, and wishing everybody all the blessings of Dhamma practice.